So, hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar with Diana Withrow and Lauren Maret, who will present today on their research results about cancer incidence and survival among Indigenous persons in Canada. So thank you for joining us. Before I introduce them, I would like to take a few minutes just to present the network for those of you who possibly may not be familiar with this organization yet. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't start my... So there you go. There you go. Sorry for that. There you go. Okay, so the CRDCN is a partnership between a consortium of Canadian universities and Statistics Canada, supported by the SSHRC, CIHR, and the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. So as the map shows here, it is truly a pan-Canadian network comprising 30 RDCs currently and branches located throughout the country. The very last one, most recent one, opened its door in northern British Columbia last summer. RDCs, research data centers, are secure computer labs where researchers with an approved project can access Statistics Canada confidential microdata, including longitudinal surveys, census data, as well as an increasing number of administrative data files. Last year, over 1,500 researchers from various disciplines have accessed an RDC, and about a third of these were graduate students. The research carried through the network is very diverse and have helped to better understand social, economic, and health issues, as well as factors affecting individual life course and well-being. Among other topics, we can mention population aging, economic integration of immigrants, socio-economic determinants of health, income inequality, and child development. To know more about us, I invite you to visit our website. You see the address on the slide here. And you will be able to notably access the online bibliography, the data set available, and so on. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today. So Lauren Maret is scientist emeritus at Cancer Care Ontario and professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at University of Toronto. Most of her current work concerns surveillance of cancer and cancer risk factor in Ontario's First Nation, Inuit, and Métis populations, as well as research on the relationship between exposure to ultraviolet radiation and skin cancer. She has led the production of a number of reports and monographs, has authored or co-authored well over 100 papers in various scientific journals. Diana is a postdoctoral fellow in the radiation epidemiology branch of the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics at the National Cancer Institute in the USA. Working with Dr. Maret, her doctoral research comprised the first national level analysis of cancer survival among First Nation and Métis adults in Canada, and her dissertation is part of the presentation, is part of the result presented today. So her research interests include social, demographic, and economic disparities in survival and survivorship, the role of therapy on second cancer risk, and the optimal application of survival analysis techniques. So Diana and Lauren will speak in turn for about 45-50 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A period. During their presentation, all mics will be muted. To ask a question at the end of the presentation, you need to open your control panel, and you should be able to see this little white arrow in the orange box at the top right-hand side of your screen. So open it, and then you can see the question tab where you can type your question, and press. Once it's typed down, you just need to press send, and we'll read them for you when the time comes. So I want, in conclusion, just to say that all our webinars are available afterwards on YouTube. So this one will be available in the next few days, and there are several others that you might want to have a look at. So I invite you to have a look at on a YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to give control to our speaker, starting with Lorraine. And thank you very much, both of you, for being with us today.
Okay, so just so you know, this is my voice, Lorraine, and I'm going to disappear from your webcam while we do the presentation. But at least you heard my voice for a moment. I'm just getting my. Okay, so I wanted to first acknowledge our partners in this project that we're going to talk about today. It was funded by the CIHR's Institute of Aboriginal People's Health. The Cancer Care Ontario's Aboriginal Cancer Control Unit led the work with myself as scientist, Diana Withrow, who has been a PhD student, and our director, Alethea Kiwiosh, as a key knowledge user and collaborator. Statistics Canada was data custodian, performed the linkages, controlled how many database. Yeah?
Sorry, I think you're not sharing your screen right now. You need to click share my screen.
Okay. Now? Is it shared now?
Just a minute. Not yet.
Okay, I don't know how to share it then, I'm sorry.
If you transfer the control to me, I can pull it up.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, Diana, you should have control now.
Yes, no problem. Okay.
Okay.
Can you make it full screen?
I will, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Go.
Okay, so you're going to control the slides, Diana?
I will.
Or am I? Okay.
I'll try to anticipate your needs, but you can also cue me if I'm.
Okay. Thank you. Statistics Canada was involved as the data custodian, as I said, and Michael Chepkema, scientist in the Health Analysis Division, was also a co-investigator on the study. And we involved the health portfolios of the Assembly of First Nations and the Métis National Council as key knowledge users, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Next slide. The background. First, in terms of Aboriginal peoples of Canada, there are 3 constitutionally recognized groups. And I'll use the word Aboriginal because that's the word used in the census that was the basis of this study, even though nowadays the preferred word is Indigenous. So the largest group is the First Nations group, comprised mostly of status or registered First Nations, about 600 and some thousand, 200,000 non-status people who self-identify as First Nations, and this is according to the 2011 National Household Survey, accounting for 2.5% of the total Canadian population at that time. I think there's another slide, sort of a thing on top of this, Diana, right, with definitions? Yes. So the status Indians are those who are registered as Indians under the Indian Act, and they have certain privileges by the federal government, responsibility of the federal government. And those who are non-status, they've either lost their status or their ancestors were never registered or lost their status. In other words, never had treaty agreements of some kind under the provisions of the Indian Act. Next, can you do the next thing, Diana, please? Sorry. And then there's the Métis, which are about 450,000, again in 2011, or 1.5% of the total Canadian population. And the Métis it's a very specific definition of people who are of First Nations and European, particularly the fur traders and earliest settlers' ancestry, who organize themselves into distinct communities and develop their own distinct identity, culture, language, and way of life. And they are known as collectively as the Métis Nation. And the smallest group is the Inuit, about 60,000, and a very small percentage of the total Canadian population. Next slide. So why do we have to do a specific research project like we're talking about today in the RDC when we have a very good network of cancer registries across the country? You think we could just look at cancer incidence and survival and First Nations and Métis people just like we can in the general population, say, of Ontario or Manitoba or all of Canada. The fact is that ethnicity and race is not generally recorded in health data systems in Canada. And this is also true for the majority of our cancer registries. Northwest Territory and Nunavut are accepted where they do collect information on Inuit, Métis, and First Nations status. So we can't routinely track cancer burden nationally or provincially in our Indigenous populations or in any other racial or ethnic group. And this results in challenges to get the data that you need to have for advocacy, priority setting, action, and so on. And means that we have to do special research projects, such as the one we're going to talk about today, to acquire this important kind of data. Next. So the aims of this study are to assess the cancer burden in our Aboriginal people to support cancer control, specifically cancer incidence rate and survival in Canadian adults reporting First Nation or Métis ancestry in the 1991 census long form. Why ancestry? At the time of the 1991 census, that was the question that was asked. Nowadays, there would be a question about identity, which would be the question that the preferred question that one would base a study on today. You'll notice that the Inuit are not included, and that's because there were concerns at Statistics Canada about the quality of the linkages that were required to complete this study in the Inuit population. And the second objective was to compare these estimates with those for Canadians reporting no First Nations, Inuit, or Métis ancestry in the census. Over to you, Diana.
Yes. So in order to overcome the challenge of not having ethnic identifiers in cancer registries or other health databases in Canada, we used what is currently known as the 1991 Canadian Census Health and Environmental Cohort, but was previously known as the 1991 Census Mortality Cohort. So the foundation of this data set was the 1991 long-form census. The long-form census was distributed to 1 in 5 households in the general population and all households on reserve or in remote areas. This was linked to the Canadian Death Database, which contains deaths from 1991 to 2009, and also to the Canadian Cancer Registry, which included incident cases of cancer between 1992 and 2010. The tax files that you see in this flowchart in gray were included to update the addresses, which improved the quality of the linkage, and also provided us with data about deaths that were not reported in the Canadian Mortality Database or the Canadian Cancer Registry. So together, with all these data sources coming together, we had 2.7 million people who represented a 15% sample of the Canadian population aged 25 and older on Census Day in 1991. And this was the cohort that we used to do the incidence analyses. Quebec collects date of diagnosis information differently than the rest of Canada. And so, as has traditionally been done in national level analyses of survival, Quebec was excluded from the survival analyses, and we had a separate survival sub-cohort, which was the rest of Canada, excluding Quebec. In order to identify First Nations, Métis, and non-Aboriginal people in the long-form census, we used responses to several questions. Respondents were asked, as Lorraine mentioned, whether they had North American Indian or Métis ancestry, as well as a list of other candidate ancestries. And people were able to report as many ancestries as they felt were relevant to them. So we've defined First Nations people as those people who reported North American Indian ancestry only, or membership in a band or First Nation, or registration under the Indian Act. And using this definition, we identified 62,000 people, approximately, of the 2.7 million sample, who were First Nations. Métis people we defined as having Métis ancestry and up to one other ancestry. They were not First Nations, as I previously defined, and using this definition, we had approximately 11,000 people who met the definition for Métis. And then finally, we used non-Aboriginal people as a comparison group, and they were non-First Nation, non-Métis, and also did not report Inuit ancestry only, and that was approximately a cohort of 2.7 million people. In some of our analyses, particularly when we were comparing the incidence and survival, we considered the extent to which income or rurality played a role in the differences between the Indigenous populations and the non-Aboriginals. And so we've shown you here the distribution of subjects by their income quintile, and you can see here that First Nations and Métis were more likely than non-Aboriginals to be in the lowest income quintile. This is based on postal code at response to the census. And then also, as you would expect, the Métis and First Nations were more likely to live in a rural area. In order to estimate incidence, we estimated follow-up time from January 1st, 1992, which is the earliest incidence data we had, to the date of death, or the 31st of December 2009, which is the latest death information we have. We included persons aged 25 to 99 at cancer diagnosis, and we age standardized the incidence rates to the world standard population. We estimated relative risks comparing First Nations or Métis to the non-Aboriginal population, and these were done using Poisson models, which controlled for differences in age and sex, rurality, and income quintile. And this slide serves two purposes. First, I want to draw your attention to the number of cancers in each group. So you can see that in the Métis, we only had 1,090 cancers to estimate incidence. In the First Nations, 5,080, and then in the non-Aboriginals, about 336,000. So you can see that we, despite having sort of the largest data source available to do this work, we nevertheless encountered some problems in terms of power because of the small numbers, particularly in the Métis. Then you can also see here the distribution and the relative importance of the different cancers by frequency. And you can see that for each group, the same 4 cancer types account for over 50% of the cancer diagnoses. But these are in a slightly different order depending on the population. And some of this represents a different distribution of age and gender, since these are just the frequencies rather than the incidence rates. So now I'll pass it back to Lorraine to talk about the incidence rates.
Okay, thank you. So this is the only slide that compares head-to-head First Nations and Métis. All the other slides will just be comparing First Nations with non-Aboriginal, Métis with non-Aboriginal. The reason I don't have them head-to-head through all the slides because they do not like to be directly compared. However, just to give you the summary, for all cancers combined, we've shown them together. The color scheme will be carried throughout the slides, with blue representing non-Aboriginal, the sort of the reddy brown First Nations, and the green will always be the Métis. In this case, we're showing women and men separately, and the age standardized incidence rate per 100,000 person years is along the x-axis. So what you can see here is that for the first and the women, that the Métis women have statistically significantly higher incidence rates of all cancers combined than the non-Indigenous population, whereas the First Nations women have about the same. In men, the picture is rather different, where the First Nations men have significantly lower incidence than the general population, where the Métis men and the general population have about the same incidence rate. Of course, cancer is many diseases, and so the devil really is in the details when you start looking at specific cancer sites, which is what we do next. So this is for men, the incidence in First Nations, the most common cancers in the First Nations population, and they're ordered in that way. And this compares the First Nations and the non-Aboriginal population of Canada, again in the red and blue respectively. The green boxes, pairs of bars represent significantly low incidence rates, and the yellow boxes represent significantly higher in the First Nations men. So first of all, as Diana mentioned, the same three cancers are equally common. This is just men now, so we see prostate, lung, bronchus, and colorectal, and these are in the same order in the two populations in terms of the rates. Prostate cancer is statistically significantly lower in First Nations men, as is non-Hodgkin lymphoma and bladder cancer. Lung and bronchus, the other main cancer, is about the same, and we see statistically higher rates for colorectal, kidney, and liver. And note how high kidney is on this list. It is quite a bit higher in terms of the frequency of cancer for First Nations men than it is in the non-Aboriginal population, where you can see cancers like bladder and non-Hodgkin lymphoma are more common than kidney in the general population. Next slide. So this is the same picture, but for women now. And again, breast, colorectal, and lung and bronchus are the three most common cancers in both populations, but with a slightly different order. Again, as with prostate cancer, breast cancer is significantly low in First Nations women. As in men, colorectal cancer and kidney cancers are statistically significantly higher. Unlike in the men, lung cancer is also higher in the women. Remember, in the men, it was about the same. Cervical cancer and stomach cancer significantly higher in women, while thyroid cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and cancer of the body of the uterus are significantly less common in the First Nations women. And this just shows you a summary of the sites for which they are higher. Rates are higher in First Nations on the left and lower on the right for males and females. So there you can see that colorectal and kidney are high in both sexes, which I think are quite alarming. We can talk about that later if you like. Next slide. So now moving to the Métis in green and the non-Aboriginal in blue. As Diana said, we have much less power in the Métis population to identify differences with the general population. And so what we see here is that lung cancer is statistically more common as it's larynx cancer in Métis men compared to non-Indigenous men. And otherwise, there are no differences, statistically speaking. And in women, again, we see higher rates of lung cancer, as we did for the men, and higher rates of cervix cancer, as we saw for First Nations women, and higher rates of stomach cancer, as we also saw for First Nations women. Next slide. And again, this is the summary with the high rates of lung cancer. In some ways, similar to the picture we saw for the First Nations. I'll now pass it over to Diana.
Yes, I will just summarize the results relevant to survival, and the same cohort generally applies, but there were some restrictions. As I mentioned, we excluded Quebec. We limited to persons aged 45 to 90, which was most of the cancers. This was related to the fact that we estimated relative survival using ethnicity, age, sex, and calendar time specific life tables that we built from the census mortality cohort. And these were only reliable between the ages of 45 and 90, or at least more reliable. We excluded those cancers that were death certificate only, autopsy only, or had negative survival time, meaning that their date of diagnosis came after their date of death. And to compare survival between the populations, we used excess mortality rate ratios adjusted for age, sex, the decade of diagnosis, their income quintile, and rurality. So in these analyses, we limited to a number of index cancer sites that had sufficient numbers to conduct the analyses. And when we make that limitation, you'll see that for Métis, we only included 545 cases at 4 sites. And for the First Nations, we included about 3,300 at more like 11 sites. So again, we still have an issue related to power. And I just wanted to provide this for context to show that again, there are far fewer Métis cancer cases. So this slide shows the excess mortality rate ratios. It's comparing survival between First Nations and non-Aboriginal people. And a number above 1 indicates that the First Nations had poorer survival from these cancer types. And you can see for all but multiple myeloma, the number is 1 or higher than 1. And for those that have a red box, it was significantly higher than 1 because the 95% confidence intervals do not cross that line of 1. So they had significantly poorer survival for lung cancer, breast cancer, oral cavity and pharyngeal cancer, cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, and leukemia. And this is not entirely predictable. There are some hypotheses that those cancers that have the best prognosis would have the greatest disparities because the interventions are not being applied equally. But you can see here that both for cancers with poorer prognosis like lung cancer and of better prognosis like breast cancer, there are statistically significant differences. So you may have noticed that some big players were missing here, namely colorectal cancer and prostate cancer. That's because these differed over certain variables. So for colorectal cancer, the excess mortality rate ratio was significantly high for 2001 to 2009, but not in the earlier time period. And for prostate cancer, the opposite was true. The excess mortality rate ratio was significantly high in the earlier decade, but not in the later decade. And then we also tested whether these rates were consistent across follow-up time. And for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, there was only a disparity within the first year of follow-up, and then conditional on 1-year survival, the First Nations were no more or less likely to survive than their non-Aboriginal peers. As I mentioned, we only looked at 4 cancer sites for the Métis, and you can see here that there was only a statistically significantly poorer survival for prostate cancer. So to summarize, the First Nations had significantly poorer survival for the cancers listed here. Métis only statistically significantly poorer for prostate cancer. And when we adjusted the models for income and rurality, we really found the same results. So these don't, at least in the way we measured them, income and rurality do not appear to account for the majority of the disparity. So when we're interpreting the differences in incidence and survival, we need to take into account that there are multiple dimensions of social determinants and inequalities that could be influencing the rates that we're seeing. And for cancer incidence, some of these driving factors might be lifestyle differences, so differential rates of smoking that we know to exist in First Nations and Métis communities, higher rates of obesity, decreased access to or likelihood to uptake of various screening procedures, and then to a lesser extent genetic susceptibility. So we do see internationally that Indigenous people, for example, have a higher risk of gallbladder cancer, but we don't think that this is driving the differences we see for most cancer sites. And then for cancer survival, screening also plays a role. Catching the cancer early can contribute to longer survival, and this is related to access to a timely diagnosis and treatment. So while we weren't able to measure stage at diagnosis, we think that there may be differences in the stage at which these cancers are identified. And then, of course, the important factor of patient-provider trust and how that influences healthcare decision-making for both the patient and the provider. And finally, there's some evidence that comorbidities influence survival disparities in Indigenous populations in other countries. And so this is also possible that it's playing a role in Canada. So for example, if someone came in with several comorbidities and then got their cancer diagnosis, they may either not be candidates for the most aggressive treatment, or the aggressive treatments may exacerbate their existing comorbidities and affect their survival prospects. This study had many strengths. The census-based linkage represents a powerful tool because it allows us to have a national perspective and relatively large numbers compared even to some smaller provincial level analyses. It included First Nations and Métis as self-reported, and has the potential to be used for other ethnic groups. And we were able to take into account the socio-demographic information of these individuals, which included income, morality, and residence on reserve, which isn't often taken into account. So this is a good proof of concept for future work. However, there are some limitations. So as Lorraine mentioned, in 1991, the census asked about ancestry, but the preferred concept as of 1996 censuses is about identity. And so we would prefer to have an identity concept to base this on. Based on that identity concept, we've been able to look at the growth of the Indigenous or Aboriginal population, and we know that more people now identify as Aboriginal. So even if there had been an identity concept in 1991, we may not have had the same people reporting as First Nations and Métis as we do now in more recent census. The closed cohort prevented us from looking at trends over time, and there was insufficient information on stage to explore its effects on survival. So I'm going to hand it back over to Lorraine for some final conclusions. There's a lot of, I'll just go through the whole slide at once, Lorraine, because there's a bunch of animation for these.
Okay. So before I talk about governance, I just want to go back to something Diana said in terms of what might be responsible for some of the survival differences, and she mentioned stage and comorbidities amongst other things. And we did do a special study in Ontario some years ago where we looked at breast cancer in First Nations women from another study that we had done from another study, and in non-First Nations women to look at why the survival was poor in the First Nations women. That was an observation we had made. And we did indeed find that when we collected all the extra data that in fact First Nations women were diagnosed at a later stage, and that they also had more comorbidities. And these were the two main factors contributing to their poorer survival for breast cancer. So we suspect that's probably true in Canada for other cancers as well. So data governance is a big issue, and because working with Indigenous populations, they have their own ideas based on their past experiences in dealing with research about how they should be involved in research projects. And they have formally adopted, and this is a trademark, a registered trademark here, that you see on the right here, these principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. This is a set of standards for how to conduct research with First Nations people. It establishes how the data about these people should be collected, protected, used, and shared, and asserts that they are the ones who have control over these processes and also about how the information can be used. Of course, the devil is in the details in how one operationalizes this in the kind of data environments that we have in say, provincial cancer registries and Statistics Canada. The Métis have similar, and the Inuit as well, have similar requirements, but they are not so codified, and the data governance requirements tend to vary depending on what the project is and which Métis group you are working with. But the OCAP principles are widely accepted in First Nations research now, and they are promulgated and supported and well described by the First Nations Information Governance Center with the website on this slide. Next. Now, of course, there's the other perspective on data governance, which is the perspective of the data custodian, such as Statistics Canada, or in a provincial situation would be an organization like Cancer Care Ontario, who maintains the cancer registry. And under the Statistics Act, for example, Statistics Canada owns, controls, possesses the data for which that they collect and hold under the Statistics Act, and they have to protect this data according to the legislation. and that includes allowing analysis only at Statistics Canada and stipulating rigorous conditions for data that can be released from their data sets. The implications of this are, from a researcher point of view, that it limits exploratory analyses, small geographic areas, rarer cancers. But in terms of the data governance, working with First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, it really makes full implementation of OCAP or related principles challenging. And I think this is one of the things that we really have to attack going forward as we try to do this work better, is figuring out how we can marry these two approaches to data governance from very different types of organizations into something that works for everybody. Next slide. I mentioned at the beginning that we worked with the Assembly First Nations and the Métis National Council as knowledge users. One thing we did with them was at the end of the project, we worked with somebody in the health portfolio of each of these organizations to create fact sheets that were based on the results of this study, and also provided some additional explanatory or advisory information. And on the left is the front side, the incidence side of the sheet that we developed with the Métis National Council, where on the top we had a little man or woman person, and we showed where the cancers were, what the most common cancers were, and which were more or less common in this group, and then some messages around prevention. On the back side, we had something about survival, and on the right-hand side of the slide, I'm showing the back side of the one we developed with AFN. The two fact sheets were different because we developed them to the needs and desires of the organization. And here we presented the survival results, tried to give a positive message about people do survive cancer, some of the interpretation of the results, what affects cancer survival, and a little bit about the trajectory from diagnosis to treatment, because that was something that AFN wished us to include. Next slide. We've also disseminated by the peer-reviewed publications. So Diana has published 2 papers on the survival analysis that will form the basis of her thesis. And we also have a forthcoming publication in Canadian Medical Association Journal around incidence survival in the Métis population. And we have another article under review that's about cancer incidence in the First Nations portion of the cohort. Next slide. So in conclusion, I think we've shown evidence of distinct cancer profiles among First Nations and Métis populations and overall poor survival. And I think this supports the need for us to work with Indigenous organizations and communities to figure out what kind of additional research is needed about why the disparities and what are effective strategies for reducing these disparities. Can also support the development of strategies and databases for the ongoing monitoring of cancer burden. This is one way of collecting data. There are other ways, and I think we need to figure out how we can do this better in Canada in general. And to also secure additional investments across the cancer continuum to actually improve the situation from prevention through palliative care. To reduce the current and future burden in a holistic and culturally appropriate manner, as these groups would like to see and appreciate. Next. There is some good news. Cancer strategies are being developed or in progress for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in several jurisdictions. For example, Ontario is in its 3rd strategy, and this includes a big focus on building relationships and improving screening, prevention, and research and surveillance. And I think to date has been extremely successful. Still a long way to go, but there are a lot of successes that have been celebrated in Ontario. Our national cancer control body, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, has committed to establishing a multi-stakeholder advisory committee to try to develop a strategy or strategies for increasing data to support better cancer control in Indigenous peoples. And this would include data governance agreements, how to develop optimal data governance agreements. And finally, Statistics Canada is linking or has linked subsequent censuses to social and health data, and this will provide the opportunity when it comes into the RDCs to look at time trends, have larger sample size, and include all three Indigenous groups to further this work using this methodology. And I think that is the end of our formal presentation. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Diana and Lorraine. So it's 20 to 2 now, so we have a good 20 minutes for questions. So please, you can write them and using the question tab. It's easy, and I will read it for you. But given that we are a small number of participants, I think I will do some innovation today and open up the mics. So if you do have a mic included in your computer, you can actually ask the question directly to our presenters. So I'm going through now. Give me a second. So if you prefer, you can mute yourself to avoid background noise. And so I just leave a moment. If someone wants to start and ask the first question, go for it. That's one question. Maybe I can start. Diana, can you go back to the very last slide and tell us? I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about. Yes, thank you. So the third bullet here, the linkages between these various census and how does it work, and do you have any sense of when this should be coming up for further research? Also, Diana, you're muted. Sorry, let me see what I can do here. Okay, you should be able to speak now.
I'm afraid I don't have any details about the upcoming linkages, although I'm certainly excited about the prospect of having that data and hope that having done the 1991 census linkage will make the next linkages more efficient, and that it can become something that is routinely done, which has been the case in New Zealand. They've produced a lot of research about their Maori population using this census linkage approach, and the routine linkage is really important to be able to do that and to track trends over time. So I think it's really important, and I'll be staying tuned.
Great. Okay, I see here someone asking a question. Thank you. It's from Mike, your co-author, I believe, Mike Jepkema. Sorry for the pronunciation. So he's asking, can you speak to how your results compare to Indigenous population in the US, Australia, New Zealand, for instance?
Yes. Well, in terms of survival, we see similar magnitudes of differences between Indigenous populations in Canada and in those countries. It's a little bit tough to compare because, as you saw, despite having sort of bigger than other studies numbers, we still have some uncertainty. But I think we mostly see similar findings with other Indigenous populations in terms of the survival disparities. And then similarly with the incidence findings. Maybe, Lorraine, you want to speak more to that?
Lorraine?
She may be muted as well. You had to unmute me, but she also said she could speak about the census linkage as well.
Yes, actually she should be able to speak. I see her here. Sorry about that. Maybe, okay. Please unmute me. Yes, I'm trying. Sorry, I don't understand because I don't want to. I didn't touch your sound. So frankly, what I will do is I'm gonna give her the presentation, Diana.
Mm-hmm.
I will give her the control, see whether that works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello, Lorraine? No. Sorry about that. So I guess I don't know why she was speaking just a minute ago, and I'm going to give it back to you. All right. So maybe if we have other question. No, I don't see no other question. I'm sorry about this problem of for Lorraine. So unless someone wants to speak out, you have the opportunity now to speak out and ask a question directly if you wish. So I guess we will be finishing now. I'm sorry about these difficulties, technical difficulties, but I thank you all for being with us this afternoon. And thank you, Lorraine and Diana, for taking the time to present the result of your research. The recording will be available on our website and on YouTube in the next few days. So that's it for now, and I wish you a very, very nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.